Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take interesting source material and, well, really pull out the key insights for you.
Yeah, exactly. For you, the listener who wants to get knowledgeable fast, but also, properly.
We aim to give you that shortcut, basically, so you feel informed without getting bogged down.
And today, we're diving into something I think is really fascinating. The different ways researchers and developers tend to think when they approach the same challenge.
Our source material for this is a text originally in Korean called Yuranen Oju, which just translates to pasted text.
And what's really useful about this text is how it breaks down these two fundamental ways of thinking
Right, it talks about the truth-based approach often seen in researchers.
versus the, let's call it, experience generalization approach you often find with developers.
So our mission today is really to unpack that. How do these different thought processes lead to different conclusions? And crucially, how can they sometimes cause, well, friction, communication issues?
Exactly. We want to shed some light on why collaborations can sometimes be tricky and maybe help everyone appreciate these different viewpoints a bit more.
Okay, sounds good. Let's get into it. Where does the text start?
So it first lays out the researcher's mindset. And the core idea here is that researchers are fundamentally after objective underlying truth. That's their priority.
And they find this truth through data,
Right.
right? Through careful experimentation.
Precisely. It's all about evidence. The text uses a great cooking analogy to explain this.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
Imagine a recipe researcher. Their goal isn't just a nice pizza, it's the perfect pizza based on objective criteria.
So they're not focused on their favorite toppings or anything like that?
No, they're running hundreds of experiments, testing dough fermentation times, oven temperatures, everything. They want to find the capital T truth.
Like the text mentions specific examples.
Yeah, like discovering that, say, a 2-hour dough fermentation in exactly 220 degrees in the oven gives the objectively best result based on their tests.
Okay, so it's not about, I made a good pizza once. It's about repeatable, objective facts.
Exactly. And this rigorous approach leads to some firm conclusions.
Such as?
Well, based on all that data, the researcher might confidently say, look, making a truly perfect pizza in just 10 minutes, it's impossible.
And that's not just their opinion. It's rooted in the facts they've gathered.
Precisely. It's a data-driven conclusion about the process itself. Have you ever, run into someone who thinks that way? Super data-focused, even if your gut tells you something else.
Oh, absolutely. That definitely rings a bell. The text has another analogy too, right? Something about dice.
It does, yeah. To really nail down this idea of the researcher seeking truth through extensive data,
How did that work?
think about testing if a standard six-sided die is fair. A researcher wouldn't just roll it, say, 10 times.
No, they'd need more data than that, surely.
Way more. The text suggests something like 100,000 rolls, a
Yeah.
huge number.
Wow, okay. Why so many?
Because for a researcher, establishing the truth requires a large sample size. After 100,000 rolls, you'd expect each number to be very close to that 1 in 6 probability.
Right, but what if they only rolled it, say, 100 times and got the number 3 way more often, like 25% of the time?
A researcher wouldn't immediately yell, unfair die. They'd know 100 rolls isn't enough data. It could just be random variation.
So they understand you need a lot of trials to see the real pattern, the underlying truth.
Exactly. That need for substantial evidence is key to the researcher's mindset. Now let's contrast that with how a developer might approach the same dice.
Okay, so that's the researcher, hunting for objective truth, backed by tons of data. Let's switch gears now. How does the developer think, according to the text?
It's quite different. Developers tend to form generalized conclusions based on their past experiences, what's worked before.
So less about universal principles found in a lab and more about practical lessons learned on the job.
That's a good way to put it. It's drawing on that personal library of successes and, well, failures.
Let's go back to the cooking analogy. How does that fit the developer?
Okay, so instead of the recipe scientist, think of a cook who's just made a lot of pizzas over the years. Hands-on experience.
And maybe this cook has consistently made really good pizzas, and it always takes them about 15 minutes.
Exactly. So, based on that repeated success in their kitchen, they might generalize. Pizzas can be made in 15 minutes.
It's a conclusion drawn from what they've actually done, time and time again.
Right. But, as the text points out, that generalization, while true for them, might not be a universal truth. Maybe their setup is perfect. Always prep dough, super fast oven, everything handy.
Ah, okay. So their specific conditions allow for that 15-minute pizza.
Yeah. And if someone suddenly asks them for a 10-minute pizza, They might genuinely think, well, that's not possible because it's outside their experience. They've never done it.
It doesn't fit their generalized model of how Kitsa works. Ever had that feeling? Where something that always worked before suddenly doesn't fit a new situation.
Definitely. That, but this always worked moment. So how about the dice analogy for the developer?
Right. How does that play out?
So forget the 100,000 rolls. Imagine the developer rolls the die just 100 times.
A much smaller sample.
Much smaller. And let's say they see the number 3 pop up 25 times. Way more than you'd expect.
Okay. What would the developer conclude from that limited experience?
They might very well jump to, this die is unfair.
Because that's what their data, their personal observation showed.
Exactly. They generalize from that small, skewed sample. It's a complete contrast to the researcher who saw the same 25% in 100 rolls as just noise, needing more data.
So the developer's understanding is shaped by the patterns they see directly, even if those patterns aren't, like, statistically the whole story.
Precisely. It's built on direct observation and generalization from that.
Okay, the difference is really stark now. Researcher seeks proof, developer leans on past performance. So how does this actually cause problems when they try to work together? The text uses an AI example, right? Apple recognition.
Yes, and this is where it gets really, really practical. Let's say the project is building an AI to recognize apples accurately.
Okay. What does the researcher bring to that?
The researcher, coming from that truth-based perspective, knows from probably lots of prior work in machine learning that AI needs a lot of diverse data, a huge data set.
A data set being like a library of images for the AI to learn from.
Exactly, and the text points to a specific truth. You generally need at least 100,000 images for an AI to get really good, really reliable at recognizing apples.
And the researcher knows why, right? It's not just a random number.
Right. They understand that if you only feed the AI, say, 100 pictures of just red apples, the AI will learn a flawed lesson.
It'll think apple red.
Pretty much. It won't recognize green apples or yellow ones or apples that look a bit different.
So to get that high accuracy, the text mentions 97.5%, you need the big, diverse data set. 100,000 images. It's based on the science of it.
Correct. It's a conclusion grounded in how machine learning actually works. Now bring in the developer.
Okay, same problem. Apple recognition AI. How do they approach it?
They might think back to a previous project. Maybe they worked on an AI to recognize, I don't know, cats, and they got pretty decent results, say 80% accuracy using only 100 images.
So they have a past success with a small data set in a different context.
Exactly. Maybe cats are easier to recognize, or maybe 80% was good enough then, but the developer generalizes.
They think, hey, if I got 80% with 100 images before, surely we can push that to 97.5% for apples with just a bit more effort, maybe a few more images.
That's the kind of thinking. It's applying a rule of thumb from their history, even if the apple task is fundamentally different or needs higher precision.
And this can lead to problems, the text suggests.
Absolutely. That AI trained on just 100 red apples might seem okay at first if you only show it more red apples.
But throw it a green apple.
And it falls apart. It fails miserably because the developer's generalized experience didn't match the truth of what's needed for robust apple recognition. Ever seen that? Something works fine in one scenario, then completely bombs in another, seemingly similar one.
For sure. Assuming one size fits all can definitely bite you. Okay, so we have these two very different approaches colliding. Researcher needs data-backed truth. Developer uses experiential shortcuts. Seems like a recipe for communication breakdown.
Totally. The text really unpacks how this truth versus generalized experience focus causes friction. Let's revisit the cooking analogy again.
Okay.
The recipe researcher has their charts, their data. It clearly shows 2 hours for dough, 13 minutes baking. That's the optimal truth they found.
So they present this objectively, right? Here's the table, here's the graph. This is why a 10-minute pizza isn't feasible according to the experiments. No guesswork.
Exactly. Purely evidence-based. Now, think about the AI example.
Same logic applies.
Yeah. The researcher presents the performance graphs. Look, with 100 images, accuracy is all over the place, maybe 60% to 80%. Unstable.
But with 100,000 images.
It stabilizes at a consistent 97%. See? The data makes the case for needing more images. It's presented as objectively as possible.
Okay, crystal clear from the researcher side. Now, how might the developer react to this data dump?
Well, think about the pizza maker. They've made great 15-minute pizzas. So when the researcher says 10 minutes is impossible based on science,
The developer might be confused, skeptical even.
right, they might think, well, maybe your experiments didn't work, but I know what I can do. They might even question the researcher's skill.
Or pushback saying, come on, let's just try harder, shave off those 5 minutes, because their experience says it should be close.
Precisely. Their personal experience is their primary frame of reference, and they struggle to accept the researcher's data-backed truth about limitations.
And the same happens with the AI example.
You bet. The researcher shows the graphs proving 100K images are needed for 97.5%. The developer, remembering their 80% success with 100 images on that other project,
might still insist, no, I think we can get there with fewer images. Maybe you're being too cautious or making it too complex.
Exactly. They might even doubt the researcher's competence in AI. It really shows how those different starting points, objective truth versus past experience, lead to completely different interpretations. A real communication barrier.
So what's the absolute root cause here? Why does the communication just stop?
The text boils it down to this. The breakdown happens when the developer struggles to understand, or more importantly, accept the truth the researcher is presenting.
Even when the researcher shows clear data for the AI needing 100K images.
If the developer is stuck on, but my experience tells me otherwise, the conversation hits a wall, there's no progress.
Like the pizza example again.
Right.
Researcher explains the science of baking times, but the cook, based on their 15-minute routine, just says, try harder.
Exactly that. There's a fundamental disconnect about what's even possible or required.
And the text says effective communication needs some kind of shared foundation, a shared acceptance of basic truths.
That's the key insight. If one person doesn't accept the objectively presented truth from the other, they're essentially operating on different planets. The conversation stalls.
It's like they're speaking different languages.
That's the perfect analogy the text uses. The researcher is clearly explaining in English, based on the data, 100 images won't work for this goal.
But the developer replies in French. But my past experience says we should try. Work harder with what we have.
Right. There's just no mutual understanding, no common ground to build on.
Which leads to the next point. Why might researchers sometimes just seem to, well, give up in these situations?
Because, as the text argues, some things are just genuinely impossible, no matter how skilled you are or how hard you try.
Like the dice example. You can't force perfect 16th results in only 100 rolls.
Exactly. There's randomness. And with the AI, you can't magically conjure 97.5% accuracy from a tiny, inadequate data set like 100 images, especially for a complex task like Apple recognition.
The text calls it a limit of reality, right? Like trying to fly without wings.
Yes. It's just not feasible. And when a researcher has laid out the data, explained the limitations objectively, shown the truth,
and it's still rejected, still met with, just try harder,
then continuing the argument becomes pointless, really. It's futile.
So the text suggests the researcher might reasonably decide to stop trying to convince that person.
Understandably, yes. They might conclude it's more productive to communicate with people who are actually open to accepting the evidence-based truth they're presenting.
Okay, to wrap this up then, the text gives a final summary contrasting the two.
It does. It reiterates. Developers tend to think by generalizing from their own experience, like the cook with only 10 recipes.
Who assumes their 15-minute pizza method is universal, even if science says otherwise.
Right. Whereas researchers operate from truth derived from systematic experiments and data, like the food scientist.
Who proves with data that the pizza needs 15 minutes and presents that objectively, without personal bias swaying the facts.
Exactly. And the critical point about communication breakdown
is that it happens mainly when the developer prioritizes their limited experience over the researcher's well-documented truth.
And the text is clear. This isn't necessarily the researcher's fault for not explaining well enough. It often points to the developer not being ready or willing to accept that truth.
There's even a really neat one-sentence summary in the original text, isn't there?
Yes, specifically for a general listener, it translates nicely. A developer is like a cook who believes, based on my experience, a pizza can be made in 15 minutes, while a researcher is like a food scientist who proves through experiments the truth that a pizza needs 15 minutes. If the developer doesn't accept the researcher's truth, the conversation can break down.
That captures it perfectly. So concise.
It really does. So for everyone listening, the big takeaway from this deep dive is really just recognizing these fundamentally different ways of approaching problems.
Understanding that contrast, truth-seeking data focus versus experience-based generalization, can genuinely help in collaborations.
Right.
And just in understanding different people.
Absolutely. It gives you a framework for maybe why some conversations feel stuck or why people seem to be coming from such different places.
So we'd encourage you, the listener, to maybe think about this. Have you seen these mindsets clash at work, on a project, maybe even just chatting with friends?
Yeah, where have you observed this dynamic? And that leads us to a final thought to leave you with.
Go on.
Now that you kind of have a handle on these two approaches, think about this. What could happen if you started actively recognizing them? In yourself and in others?
Could that actually unlock more effective communication, better problem solving?
Yeah, what might change if we consciously tried to bridge that gap between valuable personal experience and hard-won objective truth?
That's definitely something interesting to chew on. Food for thought.